InspirED Virtual Learning Series. Welcome to InspirED. As we continue to watch the COVID-19 pandemic evolve in Ohio, this school year looks different for everyone. And that is why InspirED was created by the Ohio Department of Education's Office for Exceptional Children and OCALI. Because you are here with us today, we know that you are interested in expanding your knowledge and capacity through online learning. So we also want you to know about OCALI Online, the nation's premier autism and disabilities conference. While we usually bring thousands of people together in Columbus, Ohio each year, this year, we're doing it all virtually. Registration is open now. We invite you to join us November 11th through 13th. Head over to ocali.org to learn more. Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We are excited to connect with you as part of the InspirED Virtual Learning Series. This series is dedicated to providing timely information and resources to professionals and families supporting students, including those with disabilities, in a virtual learning environment. The content of this webinar has been pre-recorded, but we want to encourage your participation. If you have any questions or comments, we invite you to be part of the discussion by using the chat feature. Questions will be answered throughout the webinar, and later we'll be providing a link in the chat to a brief survey. By completing the survey, you'll be able to access a certificate verifying your attendance in this webinar.
Hi, I'm Christine Croyle, the Program Director at the Outreach Center for Deafness and Blindness at OCALI.
I'm Heather Herbster, and I'm an outreach specialist with the center.
My name is Abby Weaver, and I'm an itinerant teacher for the deaf and hard of hearing in the state of Ohio.
Welcome to Access in a Virtual Environment, proactive planning to support effective communication for learners who are deaf or hard of hearing. Teachers, administrators, and family members are all working together to ensure communication access during this time of virtual learning. And the classroom has been redefined. Each of us can identify with the impact that has had on learning and the connection. For learners who are deaf or hard of hearing, having access to communication options that work provide bridges to learning in every setting. But this doesn't just happen. It takes focused effort and thoughtful planning. In this session, you will learn about considerations and strategies to support effective communication in the virtual environment. Our objectives for today are identify planning considerations for individual and group learning experiences that support active participation in the virtual and face-to-face environment. You will also learn strategies and proactive planning to support effective communication, both expressive and receptive, in the virtual and face-to-face learning experiences. In the corner, you'll notice there's a picture on the slide with words, think about things differently, and differently is upside down. So during this time, we challenge you to do this as you think about planning for access in a virtual space for learners who are deaf or hard of hearing. You will also notice we'll use some of these strategies as we go through this session. For example, the chat box, if you'd like to put something in the chat box, that will go to us as hosts, and we'll be happy to respond to you. This will eliminate some of the interference that those who are deaf or hard of hearing might experience while trying to watch captions or use interpreters. As you see some of these strategies, please make a note in the chat box.
All right, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about communication in the learning environment. I think probably during this time of the pandemic, there is nothing that we can relate to more than how challenging sometimes communication can be. And that's across the board. That's for everybody. On our slide here, we have, for the students in the learning environment, we have a teen who is looking at a laptop with another teen. She has earbuds in. She's got a piece of paper to write things down. So if you think about it, and the teen on the computer screen looks like as if she's communicating something. So if you think about that, that's a lot of pieces and parts to make meaning, right? If I'm the student sitting there with the earbud in, I've got auditory information coming in. I've got visual information coming in from what's coming on from the computer screen. And then I'm trying to take notes on that, whatever that may be, so that I have a reference. That's good. In an ideal world, bandwidth is working. We're both taking turns and it's pretty easy. It's one-on-one. So that's always nice. And what we're thinking about is just all the different points of focus that this person has to pay attention to. Now, what I want you to do and think about this whole session is I want you to think about students who then, if we add in the addition of maybe some sort of level of deafness or hearing loss. Okay. So for that student, maybe depending on their preference and their need, the components, other additional things to pay attention to that we might be adding into this equation might be adding in an interpreter. So maybe we have an interpreter somewhere on the screen that the student's paying attention to. Maybe we have captioning running along the bottom. So that's written text. Now let's go ahead and just for the fun of it, let's go ahead and throw in a classroom of 20 kids. Okay. And you can think about all the different ways that impacts the information coming in and how the brain has to work to manage that information. So hopefully when you're walking away from today, you're having those things in mind, and understanding student preference is probably one of the most important things that we can do. Being flexible and adaptable is also super important right now, depending on wherever, if your district has chosen, if you happen to be in, let's say, a hybrid model, but all the surrounding districts, maybe you have half that are 100% virtual at home and you have half that are face-to-face. Everybody's doing things a little differently. They're using different software. They're using different, and communicating through all of this is what's going to help us learn from one another. I'm going to also guess that folks in the audience have different levels of experience related to deafness. And so because you've had maybe different students that you've supported in the past, you might have ideas of how something worked. And maybe it worked well for that student, maybe it didn't. But the truth is every student is very unique. And when we throw in all the things that we're dealing with related to virtual communication, there's a whole new world that we're just starting to explore. So let's go ahead and keep that in mind too. So in order to do this, how are we going to do it effectively? The first thing we're going to do is make sure that we have the right people on board, having the right conversations. I guess we want to think across environments. So we're not thinking about learning, but we're thinking about how academic information is coming in, let's say in one classroom versus another. And then within those environments, all the different things that can impact access. So maybe, for instance, face-to-face, a gym, may sound different than a classroom or a student going into a cafeteria. But when we put a spin on that and think about students at home, the environment is just as important. I personally have 3 kids who are learning virtually right now. And, when a kid unmutes or turns on their video and you can see all the different things that are going on, a lot of potential distractors are there, a lot of potential barriers. So bringing the right people on board to talk about, like some of those folks could include the classroom teacher, any intervention specialist, including teacher of the deaf, interpreters, if we've got family members, educational audiologists, speech pathologists, the list goes on, because we really want to take a holistic view. Right. And that's what's going to inform kind of how we plan and assess. And then we just think about remembering that this is not a one-man show. And the truth is the only constant, and we've heard this quote before, but really, I don't know that I've ever known that it applied more than today, but the only constant in life is change. Right. So we just got to be there to ask questions, have the right people on board to think about environments, to look at technology, and to think about accessibility features that are going to support students along the way.
So we're looking at this slide, considerations for supporting effective communication. We want to really focus on that word effective. And effective communication is really a two-way street. So you may feel that it's effective, but is it effective for that student, that learner? Because sometimes people, they're not in your shoes and they're not aware that there's a problem. And a young student that's deaf and hard of hearing, they may not even be aware that there's a problem because you don't know what you're missing until someone sometimes points it out. So communication in sign language, spoken English, PECs, gestures, written communication, or a combination of all these different ways of communicating for a child to receive information receptively or to communicate expressively. So we have to be careful when we consider the different options for communication. We have to be really mindful, and that can be the learning environment, as Heather was talking about. Are you in the physical environment? Are you in the virtual environment? Are you in the virtual environment 2 days a week? In the physical environment 3 days a week? And that's going to require a lot of moving pieces if you're doing a hybrid or a traditional learning model where everyone's wearing masks. The age of the students, such as preschool, they may not be wearing masks, the students, but the teacher is. Or now you're looking at high school, that's going to be completely different when you've got 7 different teachers that you have to communicate with versus elementary where it may be 2 teachers. The features of technology, such as I have different communication preferences. If I'm doing a meeting in English or in American Sign Language, I might use a different virtual platform because in one vendor, I can pin the speaker that may not be speaking but signing, and they're not going to disappear when there's an audio noise that comes in and hijacks the screen away from my interpreter or the person that's signing. Language preferences. How does the person want to communicate? Right now, I'm communicating in spoken English, but I may need to receive information visually. So there's a lot of dynamics that go on there, or I may need to sign back to my interpreter to voice what I'm saying into the virtual space. Literacy level and skills of both the student and the household. I've been doing virtual lessons with preschoolers and high schoolers and middle schoolers. It's different, okay? As you know, if you have someone that is not a fluent reader, trying to navigate the screen, click on this, click on that when you're in a different environment can be really challenging. Or if you have parents that may not be as skilled with technology, that's going to impact your ability to connect with that student in that household. You also want to be mindful of the impact of auditory and visual fatigue in learning in physical environments where masks are being used and social distancing, or in the virtual environment when now you have compromised hearing. Hopefully you're using assistive technology to connect to that laptop and stream the audio in your hearing aids or your cochlear implant. But fatigue is going to be very real. All of us have heard of Zoom fatigue or other platforms. And that is with, in most cases, typical vision and typical hearing. Now add the added burden of having a compromised auditory system, or you're trying to do a 3D visual language, but now it's on a tiny screen. So you need to be mindful of the screen size. Am I looking on a smartphone or an iPad or tablet or a laptop, or do I need 2 screens? And also the whole issue of bandwidth. That can really impact the clarity of the audio signal, the spoken voices coming through. They can also impact the sign language. So if I'm signing and all of a sudden you get that ghost image where you can kind of see, the fingers are trailing, that's really going to impact my ability to access the instruction. You may have the best interpreter, but if you haven't thought about lighting and bandwidth, camera, high definition, low definition, you're going to really need to connect with your technology department to make sure you have that clear access, because that's going to help reduce the fatigue that you're already going to have to encounter right out of the gate because you're doing virtual or traditional instruction with masks and social distancing. Many of my families have never had to use, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, the Roger touchscreen, which is a microphone for a deaf and hard of hearing student by Phonak. Many of them have never had to use that because that was always a school-based microphone, and mom and dad never had that in the home environment for some of my families. So now all of a sudden you get this smart little microphone, but you need to connect it to a laptop. How does one do that? What cords? How do you connect it to the hearing aid? So I will say there's been some parking lot instructions or Zoom instruction. This is the microphone, plug it in this way, plug it into your laptop. And I've had to show families how to do that, especially for my little ones. My older kids were more familiar with it. So it wasn't that big of a deal when it was like, okay, now you need to do this at home versus in the traditional classroom. But even in the traditional classroom, how I connect that microphone to my laptop or the smartboard or the teacher or my peers, it's going to vary based on the type of instruction and the type of learning that I need to do. And those are for students that may be using their residual hearing. The next slide is addressing access expectations. Many people are like, oh, I thought you were taking care of that. Oh, I thought you were doing that. Wait, that's my responsibility? You want to have a really good dialogue with your team. Who does what? So if it's the science class that needs to be made accessible, is the science teacher being held to making that content accessible, both receptively and expressively for the deaf and hard of hearing child? If you haven't made it accessible up front for your classroom content, there may be someone else that's getting tapped on the shoulder, such as the itinerant teacher for the deaf and hard of hearing, the intervention specialist, who is now scrambling to make your content accessible. It's always best to think about that up front. So you may use a vendor that your school is paid for. As an administrator, I would encourage you to ask, is this content accessible for my deaf and hard of hearing student? Is there closed captioning that's easily accessible? Or am I going to have to pay and have designate someone in my staff What needs to be made accessible? This could be media, live, streaming, but it can even be a worksheet. If the student is using an interpreter in the classroom to access English and they're reading something and they may be a new reader and you're trying to go between two languages, then the interpreter should make that information accessible as well. And it can be the classroom teacher reading the worksheet, like you do in kindergarten and first grade. The teacher's like, all right, put your name at the top. Number 1, they read the sentence. They should also be able to see the interpreter. Where will the access be? This should be embedded, smooth, and easy without the access burden being placed upon the deaf and hard of hearing student. I know sometimes for myself as a deaf and hard of hearing adult, I'm constantly generating my own captions, my own subtitles. I'm using machine-generated captioning. I'm having to get extra cores. I'm scrambling to. It's so refreshing when you come into a classroom environment and it's been made accessible for you. Also, I've had to remind teachers how a student accesses captions. Really, the teacher should be generating that and doing that on a screen share versus putting that burden on the student who's already trying to navigate content that they don't know. How and when will equal access be provided? So this may be captioned and or the interpreted message, and what manner and timelines. How long will it take to get access to the student? And it shouldn't be delayed. I've had situations where even adult friends that were taking college classes where they didn't get the media caption until like a week later, and they are already a week behind in their class. And that really kind of puts you in a jam when it's time to study for that test or do that project, and you're constantly a week behind, or you're having to watch the content later a second time, giving up more of your personal time to watch it with the accessibility features finally embedded. So in some cases, you're watching the video twice and you're doing double duty, whereas your peers can just walk into the virtual space or the physical space and have access. One example I'll share is when I was in high school, they were showing Romeo and Juliet, and I was lip reading the film. It wasn't captioned, and for like 2 days, I'm like, nothing's lining up, nothing's making sense for me here. What's going on? And I finally said something to my teacher. She's like, oh, it's French, but dubbed in English. I spent 2 days frustrated as a student in my seat thinking something was going on and didn't really have access. And I got so frustrated, and I was a fluent reader. I was like, forget this. I'm not even paying attention anymore. I've mentally checked out. I'm just going to read the story. I know what happens. It's a well-known story. You want to avoid those kind of moments of frustrations for your learners.
Great. Thanks, Abby. I love it when Abby provides examples, because it really syncs up, helps me kind of absorb the idea and really apply it to different situations. You think, oh yeah, that's right. I never even thought about that. And when we're thinking about access to, as far as the idea of access to content, that's one thing. And I'm going to shift gears a little bit and just talk about access to language. But when we're thinking about all these things that we're putting into place to accommodate a learner. So if we're thinking, okay, well, this makes perfect sense. We're going to learn virtually. So I'm going to go ahead and, you reference the hard packet of paper, but also I'm going to make sure that this written content, apples for apples, is set up virtually for a student using, this software or this platform or whatever it is. But we need to think about, a lot of times, especially for those younger learners, conversational language is very different than academic language and comprehension. Maybe the student isn't there yet. And so the challenge, because we're throwing in so many factors, it's important sometimes to take a step back. It's easy to think, oh, well, it's because they're at home and because their parents aren't doing this with them, or, oh, it's because this platform, but what if it is really a language level issue? And so it's remembering within all of this to think holistically about it, doing any sort of assessment. And we need to remember as well to set up what we need to have that interpretation available online, especially if we're changing learning environments. Like right now, I think about all those little ones who are maybe they're hybrid, or maybe they're full-time at home. We're thinking about like the fluency of the sign language to children who sign right now. And that's not everyone. So having access to that language and providing access to the vocabulary that's going to help them advance academically and progress and understand. Okay, so what we want to really try to do is plan for staying ahead of that, versus we're thinking about, okay, we know we're going to transition from like the spring is not a good example, because I don't think anybody would want to redo the spring again. But when we think about, okay, we're planning for fall, and there's a chance our students are going to be 100% at home, we really need to take a little bit of time and think about for the hours of the day the students linked up with their teacher, with their class. They're getting access to academic content, but at the same time, when they're at home, it's not uncommon that maybe family members don't have a ton of sign language vocabulary. Maybe they've taken that community course. So when we get into all those specifics, let's even say, like me, I know I've got an 8th grader. She's asking me stuff about geometry, which is not my strength anyway. But I mean, if I'm thinking about how I would have to, if she were a signer, and how I would have to communicate that. And then you think about the signs that somebody may come up with, like we call those home signs, or maybe the interpreter, if it's not at the same interpreter, sometimes those interpreters shift depending on what kind of agreements we have set up. But the signs they use may not always be the same. So not only are you trying to learn this new concept, but you're also trying to figure, it's just like your example to me is very similar to your example of Shakespeare. So really thinking about the level of fluency as we're thinking about access to content, but also access to language. Things like software where it translates speech to text or text to speech. We're never going to assume that this is going to work for every kid. But at the same time, it could be for some students a great tool for the toolbox. What's really important to remember in all that is that we're checking it's accessible, and that we're checking for understanding along the way. If we just settled, for a student we said, oh, here, this is what we need. We're going to change environments. We're going to install the software, and you're good to go. But the truth is there could be all kinds of hiccups. And so we need to have conversations around that.
And then for accessible PPE, to give the best auditory and or visual access. As Heather was talking about, you really need to kind of do trial and error to see what works best in what situation. And this is a great visual here as far as the different types of masks that you can see on this graph. So at the top of the graph, you see best for speech, and at the bottom, you'll see worst for speech. So at the top, the best for speech is the KN95 or surgical, but the worst for speech is a 2-layer cotton, plain, and denim mask. And even if you look at the accessible aspect, where you have the vinyl window where you can see, or that face shield, that's actually the worst for speech. But in my particular case, I want the visual cues. I'm really relying on that. And then I'm also using assistive listening devices such as my Roger Pen or Roger touchscreen microphone to help clean up the audio and get it into my hearing aids and get it to me the best that we can. And then I'm using what's left of my residual hearing to make sense of all that auditory input. But for me, I really rely on that visual component. So when I go out into the schools, I have a whole variety of masks, and I will have in the same building 4 deaf and hard of hearing students, and one will prefer the surgical mask because he wants the better auditory clarity and quality. Whereas my other one, she will kind of shut down if I wear that surgical mask, and she'll put her head down on the table. And we're working on her, verbalizing that, like, I want to see your mouth. I need to see your lips. That helps me. Lip reading at best gives you 30%. In the content, you can see their lips. There's not facial hair. They're not turned sideways, so now you can't really see them depending on the angle or the glare. So ultimately, trial and error. You need to see what works best for your student, and they may or may not be able to tell you. They may not know because we're all new at this. So that's, again, why I carry all those masks, and I try them on so they can kind of be like, I like that one better. And they may not be able to explain why in the beginning. So really watch their body language, but also varies on how they want to interact and access, the teachers, their peers. So many of us are talking about the staff wearing masks, but also if I'm trying to identify who's speaking in the classroom environment, and there's 5 kids or 20 kids, depending on the space, and they all have masks on, when you have a hearing loss, you cannot localize sound and identify where it's coming from. And me, I even struggle sometimes with gender. So now I'm trying to figure out where's the voice coming from, who is it, and I have no visual access, no cues on it's on the right side of the room, the left side of the room, it's a boy or a girl. So it's kind of like playing tennis, trying to find that lip reading cue, maybe with the movement of an eyebrow, maybe the movement of a cheekbone. It can be stressful. You're kind of in that vigilant state. And for some students, this can even seem like anxiety. So you might want to be mindful of that. And they may just be plain worn out by the end of the day. So, and you may not see the meltdown at school, but it may happen later on when they get home. This is accessible PPE. On the left, you'll see a lady with a plastic shield. It's got thin foam on top, or it's kind of like spongy, and then a thicker one on the bottom. And some of my students prefer this because they can see me no matter which way I turn my head, they have visual access. It's not as sturdy, let's put it that way, but I have some that prefer that. And then on the right, I have more of the homemade version. This is way more sturdy, and personally, I've been wearing that one more often. I will tell you, especially with the one that's homemade, I put a little bit of Dawn dish soap on the inside, on the vinyl window, and that helps with the fogging. Assistive technology, daily sound checks remotely and document this. Schools are required to have documentation on the use of assistive listening devices, such as hearing aid, cochlear implants, the microphones, even if it's parent provided. As a district, that's one way that you can show that you've provided the child was able to hear and access instruction. It's not enough to provide the technology. You have to have that documentation. It's been interesting this year. You really need to check in with your districts, your schools, your teachers, your special ed coordinator. How is that documentation happening for, the traditional 5 days a week on site, the hybrid where you're in the building 2 days a week and you're off site 3 days a week, or you're completely virtual and no one can get their hand on that technology. So my schools have risen to the challenge in different ways to address the need for that documentation. And then I've also been working with different schools on documenting this in the IEP or 504 to ensure there's no miscommunication. This spring, we were kind of blindsided, but now in many of my students on their IEP, there's a little statement that says, due to rapid shutdown or quarantining, the student will have access to school-provided equipment. So that way, if you're doing virtual instruction, now they have access to the microphone and the FMDM receivers and the patch cord to connect to the laptop. Because with your diminished hearing, if you're listening through your hearing aid, it's picking up the whole environment, and that may be your two siblings next to you in their class on a different laptop, and you're supposed to listen to this laptop. You're really going to need that school-provided technology. Assistive technology. I have 3 different pictures here. One is a laptop with Pinocchio in the captions. Nice and easy. Just click and turn it on. As a teacher, I recommend that you look at the quality of the captioning. Is it human generated by professional? Is it machine generated? Different internet sites that we maybe will go and pull a video or a clip from. If it's machine auto generated, sometimes there's errors that you don't want to have show up in the classroom in the captioning. Also, if you haven't checked the caption and it said ABC, but you're really talking about 1, 2, 3, me as a student, I'm thinking, oh, it's ABC. I don't have enough skills yet to know that was an error. As an adult who knows the content, I'm like, oh, that was a total mistake. And I might be able to change that in my mind, but as a young learner, I didn't have that, and they probably won't either. The middle picture is a laptop. That was a YouTube video that was not captioned, and I needed to learn something. So you can see I've connected my Android smartphone with a Rode SE7 cord, so that way my Android can listen and generate the caption for me because someone didn't do that. So now the burden was placed on me as a learner. On the far right, you'll see an iPad that says, my name is Abby Weaver, and I'm here today to talk about how one person can use technology to make life flow easier in the time of COVID-19 asks with masks. And you can see how the first time it didn't understand my voice with masks, and there's an error there. In this situation, it didn't impact the learning. Also, be mindful of the screen size. As you can see, the difference between the iPad and my Android phone, depending on the length of the class or the content, your eyes may start to give out. Also, think about the space for the interpreter. I usually will log into a class twice so I can have an interpreter on one screen and the content of the whiteboard or the teacher on my second laptop, so my eyes aren't failing on me with itty-bitty teacher and an itty-bitty interpreter trying to read the signs and lip read. The equipment for assistive listening devices. How will the child have access in the event of a rapid shutdown or quarantining? I had to do some parking lot drop-offs earlier this year, or even this summer, to get equipment back. How will the equipment be checked daily? Some families may be like, I know how to do it. I don't want to be bothered. As a district and a team, you're going to want to document what compromise or agreement did you come to, so that way you're protected later on. Does additional technology need to be considered? And this is due to the changes in the learning environment. As I mentioned, when I was doing virtual learning tasks, I had to find a way that I could hear the audio in my hearing aid through the microphone. But if I did that, my phone couldn't listen to generate the captions. So I actually was running one microphone, one Android phone, and 3 cords. so I could have access as an adult, sophisticated deaf and hard of hearing student. Your families and students may not be familiar with that because I didn't have to have that skill until March last year, and then I quickly had to learn that new skill. So additional technology may need to be considered.
Thanks, Abby. So we've given you a lot to think about. And what I'd like to do is just really quickly run over a tool that kind of pulls all this information into a place for you to get started. And this is a planning tool, the Communication Planning Guide for students who are deaf or hard of hearing. Mm-hmm. And what this does is it kind of walks you through, gives guidance for how to complete a communication planning form, which looks at all types of things throughout a student's day. It's broken up into 5 pieces. And I'll read through these. What we'd really say to teams is, take some time, pull your folks together, complete the form, and include it as part of the IEP discussion, include it with the IEP, and revisit it. Because things are going to change. Just like, can you imagine? I hope with things, we could say they'll change for the better and settle down some. But the plan is broken down into 5 sections, and it guides through all kinds of thinking and discussion. There's check boxes. It's really easy to use. But thinking about that first section of language and communication modality, that second, auxiliary aids and services. Number 3 is expanded support services that might be needed. Number 4 is continuous communication access. And number 5, thinking about the least restrictive environment and placement considerations. And we've got all kinds of references to kind of legislation that supports the different thinking and the federal and state guidance. So it's a really rich tool. And we'll have this as far as you can check out the website, but also it'll be as part of your handout so you can check it out on your own.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And I want to do a quick review of our objectives. We were identifying planning considerations and learning strategies for proactive planning to support effective communication. So I saw that many of you, as you noticed those, put those in the chat. It tells me that you've got it. We also incorporated some double loop learning. So some of those strategies you may have noticed we used here today, such as how we used our online space, providing captions, making sure those captions are accurate, checking our sound quality and lighting, turning off microphones when they're not in use, turning on video when you're talking. So those are strategies that you can use in your classroom and in your meetings today and beyond. And thank you for taking time to think through proactive planning for communication access in the virtual environment.
Thanks for participating in today's webinar. We've provided a link in the chat to a brief survey, and we'll also follow up by email with the same link and additional information about this series. This series is for you, and we welcome any feedback. By completing the survey, you'll be able to access a certificate verifying your attendance in this webinar. This recording and related resources will be available on demand through our website, OCALI.org. There, you'll also find upcoming and past episodes of InspirED, and you can keep the conversation going on social media. Find us at OCALI Official on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and by using the hashtag InspirEdOhio. As we move forward together in virtual learning, our connections help to inspire success. InspirED Virtual Learning Series.